Hello and welcome to the Chico Bag Podcast, where we explore how to leave everything better than we found it. I'm your host, Andy Keller, and today we're taking climate action with Austin Whitman, CEO of ChangeClimate.org. Austin leads the charge in climate labeling and carbon accountability, helping businesses take real steps towards sustainability. And in this episode, we'll explore how transparency, certification, and measurable action can drive meaningful climate solutions. Austin, welcome.
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here.
So let's just start with, why does climate labeling matter and how does it empower consumers?
Well, all of us are used to seeing labels on products, and labeling in the environmental and eco-label context has been around for really decades. The whole purpose of labeling is to fill gaps that are left by regulation, policy, to fix market failures. So companies, like it or not, still do things that aren't great for the environment. And the whole purpose of the kind of collection of eco labels that are out there is to really try to give companies an incentive to close those gaps. So whether it's rainforest protection or increasing use of organic ingredients, in the case of USDA organic. In our case, we're using a label that really focuses on pretty narrowly on the issue of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacturing process, from the distribution process tied to consumer products. And the whole purpose of the label is to give companies an incentive to be more systematic about how they address their carbon emissions.
So there is an active debate about climate. The Trump administration is rolling back some EPA rules. We've left the Paris Climate Accord as a country. What is the science and what do people need to know about climate and the greenhouse gas and what this label represents?
There is no active debate about climate change, just to be clear. There's no active debate about the science. There's no active debate about whether human-caused carbon emissions are causing global warming, global heating, climate change, however you want to refer to it. The changes that are happening in DC right now are the result of purely politically motivated decisions that frankly are not in the best interest of the US economy, not in the best interest of Americans or anyone else around the world, but they're motivated by the unfortunate reality that along with all the other liberal or woke causes, climate change has been swept up and selected for in the broad sense, both in terms of policy, in terms of rulemaking, in terms of how we think about the system of laws that govern business action and individual action. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be working in the space. I think the way we see our platform is that we can do a little bit to keep people focused, keep people's eyes focused on the ball, keep people focused on some of the things that we know that they'll have to do in 5, 10, 20 years because climate change isn't going away. Companies that stay focused on climate strategy will do better over the long run. And so that's sort of how we see ourselves fitting into the ecosystem at this particularly strange time in the movement.
So when we go shopping, we can look for products that have the climate label that your organization certifies. Can you explain, to people listening, what does it represent? Like, what does a company have to do in order to put this label on their products?
Yeah, so we've been at this for over 6 years now, and really throughout that time have maintained a certification standard that requires companies to take accountability for their carbon emissions. And the first and most immediate step that people have to do is to take a carbon inventory, which is an assessment of all the carbon emissions tied to making and delivering their products. And then we ask them to take all those tons that they just counted up and then figure out some near-term ways that they're going to start to chip away at those tons by taking on projects inside their operations, inside their supply chain. And then we also encourage companies to invest outside of their operations in market-traded instruments, which carbon credits are the most familiar of those. We also have companies putting money into renewable energy certificates and zero emission certificates and things like that for fuels and sustainable aviation fuel. Anyway, there's a wide range of types of market credits that companies are investing in. But the net of it is that a company will have gone through this process annually. So they're updating their carbon inventory annually and also taking direct financial steps to mitigate the impacts that their company's operations are having on the climate.
I've cared about the science, and I've studied the science as far as climate change, and I've been concerned. And I know as a business owner, I was really intimidated by the idea of figuring out the carbon footprint of ChicoBag. And I didn't do it for years until I found the climate label. And what I found is you guys make it approachable and doable, for an average company. And, ChicoBag's a small company, and we're able to actually account and measure our carbon. And it's not a huge project that takes PhDs. We're able to do that with revenue. And so I'd like to just give you kudos for coming up with something that any business could do. And I guess it's, for me, it's kind of sobering. So you take a look, you're like, okay, everything we do has an impact on climate. And we're living in a society where, we live in a carbon intensive society. So what is your hope? As we look forward, it doesn't seem like we're moving fast enough. We're doing enough. Some people will say, well, we can't change it. Like, so why don't we just not deal with it? So what's your answer to people that may, fall into that trap?
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, we appreciate having y'all on board for so long. It feels like it's been honestly ages since we launched, and you guys are one of the first companies in the community. And I'm glad to hear what you said about us making it easy, or at least manageable, for companies to do carbon inventories and then start to think about reduction planning. That's what we've tried to do since the beginning, to try to democratize this whole process. You said it doesn't take PhDs. The PhDs have already done the work. I think that's one of the real realities of carbon accounting. The PhDs have done the work to come up with pretty good estimates for how a certain business activity ties to climate change. And all we try to do is make that work much more accessible to people, so that you can take things that you already know, like how many dollars you spent on your utility bill last year, and turn that into carbon emissions on your inventory without a whole lot of effort. So yeah, I mean, and then, so that's like the stuff that I know in the easy part, right? Because I could explain what we do and how we work with companies. The other part of your question is really not that easy to think about, because frankly, we're not making progress on the climate. And we've seen a tremendous amount of backsliding, even just in the last couple months. We did see a lot of really encouraging signs in the last administration that the U.S. was actually getting on track to reducing its emissions at a level that I think 10 or 15 years ago, none of us thought possible, based on the investments that had gone into building out new forms of energy, based on the investments that had gone into supporting all kinds of investments in energy efficiency and new technologies. We were incredibly on track as the U.S. to see emissions drop considerably by 2030. 50% by 2030 is the overall goal. We were well on our way to that. And so there was, even within the last 4 or 5 years, there was a moment of really solid hope that we were going to be able to make progress that would avoid the worst effects of climate change. The broad strokes, the broad concept, that has kind of been based around years and years of science, climate science, is that it's really important to cut global emissions by 2050 to what's called net zero. And net zero is a state where the emissions that are going to the air are equivalent to the emissions that are being sucked out of the air by various processes, natural processes like trees growing, and then engineered processes like people running big machines to suck carbon out of the air. And so that number has to be zero, which, and to get there, we need to reduce a lot of emissions, and we're just not on track for that. So yeah, so it's a sobering time. I've been working in climate, more or less for the last 25 years. And I'll tell you that there were times, within the last decade, within the last half decade, that people really thought that we were on track to do amazing things. So I think now it's important to take a little bit of a longer term view and remember, like I said earlier, that climate change is not going away. The economic drivers are still pointing in the favor of clean energy build out. There's absolutely no rational economic reason to stop doing wind farm development or to stop solar panels. These have become symbols of, for some reason, the liberal movement, even though many farmers have them, many people in red states have them. So we'll get past that. The economics won't change, and we just have to look to that.
So, I think a good analogy that at least helps keep me grounded is, like you're in a boat, and you got to just keep your eye on the horizon. So we're seeing a lot of turmoil, a lot of changes, a lot of rollbacks right now. However, I mean, this is going to last maybe 4 years. And then a new administration will come in and maybe just reverse it all back, to where it was, So I think it's in the arc of time, it's important to realize, that these movements are bigger than one administration. And so whatever's happening, now there's always people taking action. So in the absence of a federal, push towards some of these goals that, are globally happening, what can local communities, states, or even businesses or individuals do if they care about the future and the impacts of climate on our lives?
Yeah, well, I'm a sailor and a rower and a canoeist and a kayaker and all sorts of things. So I like the boat analogy. The one that I've also heard is you're in a boat and there's a hole in it and you're sinking. And what do you do? And, at one level, you start bailing to try to get the water out of the boat as quickly as possible. At another level, you got to figure out where the hole is and fix it so that the boat is intact. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom just in that simple analogy, which is, what can municipalities do? Unfortunately, what municipalities are going to do most often, and probably where most of their budgets need to be directed, is recovery. We saw in, the hurricanes last fall, just a tremendous hit on communities in the Mid-Atlantic, and the municipalities there, they had to spend budget on cleaning up. And I think that that's really where we're going to start to see a lot of the realities of climate change hit home. Communities needing to handle stormwater differently because it's causing flooding, people needing to actually recover from real disasters, people needing to figure out how to harden their infrastructure. Yes, important. There are important efforts at the community level to think about mitigation and carbon reductions. And I think, towns do need to be investing in energy efficiency and working on their own kind of building codes and move toward net zero. But most of the financial investment is going to be in the form of infrastructure, recovery, repair, storm hardening. And that's generally what's called adaptation. All of that I shouldn't say all of it, some of that can happen without the support of the federal government, but we're also seeing a pullback on FEMA. And FEMA is an agency that has been instrumental in helping communities recover from these disasters. And so I think we run into a really interesting situation when states are forced to come up with their own disaster recovery budgets. I'm probably taking us off track here, so I'll kind of cut myself there. Loads to talk about.
You're not leaving me a lot of hope here.
When it comes to adaptation, I will say, let's step it up a level in terms of the unit that we're talking about, unit of governance. The states are in an incredible position to keep things driving forward. And that's because states have an amazing amount of capacity to build clean energy ecosystems. We see this in both, California and Massachusetts, two incredible hubs of venture funding for clean energy technologies. And though a lot of that work is supported in some way, shape, or form by states that are behind the growth of their own energy economies because they realize that it's a great opportunity. So I think there's a lot that we'll see that will continue to happen there. From a policy perspective, it's anyone's guess. We're in new territory right now, and I don't think anybody really knows how to anticipate the future of policy. We've seen Bill Gates's nonprofit philanthropy essentially ground to a halt and disappear in the last 3 or 4 weeks because they've determined that policy advocacy is just not worth it. And that's been a real shock to the nonprofit ecosystem. It's been lobbying for policy that's favorable to really, non-controversial forms of energy, at least from a Republican standpoint. But they're kind of giving up on the policy front because there's so much uncertainty. So, yeah, I don't know.
So what are the non-controversial forms of, alternative energy?
Yeah, so I said from a Republican standpoint, nuclear is kind of the one that, that the Breakthrough Institute was most favorable toward. That is generally something that Republicans can be happy with. I think solar seems to have done okay so far, although I've certainly heard that solar farms, develop the same sort of gag reflex that wind farms do. Wind has absolutely come to a screeching halt as all offshore wind permitting has been suspended. And onshore wind, we've seen development slow down significantly. One of the stats I saw recently, which is really surprising, I used to do a lot of lobbying in Florida at a time when there was barely a single solar panel in the state. This is the Sunshine State, right? And there were no utility scale solar arrays. But Florida now within the last year, has had the greatest amount of solar development of any state in the country. And Florida is a very conservative state. And so I think that that's an interesting turning of the tide in Florida that reflects some change in local politics, as well as a favorable change in how the utilities are compensated there for power, which has been a key driver and a key hurdle for solar. Yeah, I mean, it's anybody's guess as to where the new forms of energy will come. I think generally all government funding for clean hydrogen development and things that I would say should be non-controversial, it's all stopped. So it's all about oil and gas right now.
So I'm looking for hope, right? So I'm hearing, that a lot of these issues need to be fixed at a policy level in order to have any meaningful change. This is like how we generate our power, how we move, goods and services, or goods, around the country. Those are kind of the key drivers, right? That have to be dealt with at a policy level. I mean, as an individual, when we talked a little bit about, states taking the lead, there's certainly companies taking the lead on this. We all can support those efforts. At an individual level, you just talked about solar. I have solar on my house. When I have to pay for electricity, it's 50 cents a kilowatt hour. The bills are outrageous, and I'm motivated to put more solar on my home and ultimately there's a financial motivation there for me. Like, I can save money by doing that. It also is generally green energy, but in California, we're blessed with, a lot of green energy, not so much in other states. And I'm wondering, what can a consumer or just an individual household do to just make some actions that actually have meaningful impact as far as climate change is concerned?
Yeah, so the greatest sources of emissions, if you look at the level of a household, tend to be air travel, getting on airplanes, followed by road travel, transportation basically being the top two, followed by, depending on where you live, either your diet or the energy consumed in your dwelling. So if you're living in a small apartment in a relatively moderate or temperate climate, your energy used in the dwelling is not going to be all that significant. If you're living in a larger house in a cold climate, then your energy in your dwelling is going to be pretty significant. So that, or your diet, it is really something that people don't think about that much, but the amount of carbon that is tied to meat consumption in particular is just astounding. So eating less meat is one of the easiest things that people can do. I am a 99.9% vegetarian. Occasionally I'll eat bacon with my daughter, but it's such an easy switch. It's healthier generally, and it's great from a climate perspective.
And I'm noticing you're saying eat less meat. You're not saying, stop eating meat, right? That seems like an important distinction.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere. I mean, yeah. I don't think in any of this, I don't think it helps anyone to say that everything's got to be absolutist. Like, we're all humans, we all have desires, and so, yeah, I mean, but rather than eating meat 7 days a week, make it 2. Then you really enjoy those two meals.
That steak just tastes that much better.
That much better. Yeah, exactly.
Makes it even more enjoyable.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, so flying is a tough one. Look, airlines, right now cause 3-4% of carbon emissions globally, projected to get a lot higher. And we all have friends and loved ones and adventures we want to take and everything else. So that's a hard one. There's no easy answer to air travel. Airlines have done a decent job of making some of the market traded instruments like that I talked about earlier, like SAF credits or carbon credits, available with varying degrees of effect and quality. Talk for hours about that. But in general, there are ways to sort of try to stimulate clean energy development in the air industry, but it's seen as one of those really difficult to solve sources of emissions.
So what are kind of the hidden things, right? So, getting in an airplane certainly is a very active thing that, people have control over, yet there's probably decisions that people are making every day. You mentioned, eating less meat is one. Are there any others that we really can move the dial if collectively we all decided to do, X?
It's a subtle or not so subtle tee up for me to talk about what we do and why we think it's important, which is that all the things that we buy other than, including food, but in addition to food, do have embodied carbon. And that's just a fancy way of saying that when you make a chair, there's carbon emissions attached to it. When you make a shirt, there are carbon emissions attached to it. When you make a bag, there are carbon emissions attached to it. So our whole thesis is that, and look, we don't sort of think that in any way we're addressing 100% of global climate change, but some significant share of consumers' budgets go into products, TVs, cell phones, furniture, clothing, beauty and skincare, products that we buy. And the companies that are making those products do have choices in their production and in their supply chains, in their product design. And those choices can be higher carbon or they can be lower carbon. Just as we have choices in our households to eat more or less meat, companies also have choices about where they manufacture, about how they ship goods around, about how they package products. And those choices can lead to relatively higher or lower carbon emissions from every product that they ship. And we are trying to create a framework and an incentive that helps companies see that there is a lower carbon way of making things, and that when you do that and tell your customers about it, your customers are going to be happy. They're going to be happier than they would be if you didn't. And you're going to do better than your competitors who are not taking those steps. So as a consumer, it is important to also remember that even though it's invisible, like you said, Andy, getting on an airplane is a very visible thing. There's invisible emissions tied to the purchase of consumer products. And those emissions are not completely out of your control. You can have a lot of influence over them.
Yeah, when you say that, I'm thinking of, things like green beans from Chile. Those are probably going into the belly of an aircraft with a huge carbon footprint coming over. And so you could buy green beans, off season from Chile is one example. When we did the assessment to find our carbon footprint at ChicoBag, we found that shipping was a huge source of carbon. And so we, as a result of finding this out, we offered to our customers climate-friendly shipping. And what that requires the customer to do is plan ahead a little bit, because it takes longer to do climate, because, fast shipping's on an airplane, slow shipping's on a boat. So, I think one thing from my perspective that companies or individuals can do is plan ahead and not, we all want things the next day, and ultimately that impulse and I guess, immediate gratification really has a huge carbon footprint. When you think about it, it's a hidden carbon footprint that we all can change our behavior a little bit by planning ahead and taking the slow boat when we can to address climate change actively.
Yeah, all the things that Amazon has taught us or enabled in us, to expect next day shipping and to be able to expect that any of the world's products are at our fingertips and therefore we should buy more. Just forget those lessons that you've learned from Amazon and you'll do a whole lot better.
Yeah. So slow down, think about what you're buying, buy what you need. And I guess I would think about how long you have it before it goes in the trash, because ultimately that carbon footprint is realized fully kind of when it hits the trash can, that.
Right. If you throw it away, you're probably going to replace it with something else. And that something else takes materials and it costs carbon for sure. Yeah.
So buy high quality items. Obviously look for your label. The climate label is the consumer's indication that a company is looking at their footprint, measuring it, reducing what they can, and then atoning for the rest, by making investments in, restoration projects or green energy or mangrove forests or what have you.
That's right. That's right. Yep. And that's something that we think every company should be doing, just as the cost of doing business.
Great. Any last thoughts for people who care about leaving the world a better place?
I mean, there is hope. I, gave you a dose of realism earlier, but there is hope. And I think, again, one of the things that is really important to remember is a lot of what's lower carbon is just better. And, that's because it's a better product that's better designed because the company just cares more. Think about, for example, some of the worst offenders in the fashion industry are the ones who make the cheapest and most disposable and short-lived clothing. The clothing isn't better and it's higher carbon and it cycle through it more. And those companies are notoriously irresponsible when it comes to carbon emissions. So, low carbon things do tend to be better. This applies to heat pumps. It applies to electric vehicles, if you can afford one. It applies to the forms of energy that we have now that don't spew tons and tons of not even carbon emissions, but other terrible toxic compounds into the air. Clean is generally better. And I think that is becoming more and more true as we invent new technologies. And at a certain point, it just won't even be a political issue anymore. People will be choosing the thing that's better because it's better. And when they choose that, it will lead to lower emissions. And so that's, I think, that's something that we should be excited about, happy about, something that can continue. I think we all should insist that we continue to have the freedom to make those choices. And if we do, then we'll make it through. Keep our eyes on the horizon, keep bailing the boat, fix it.
Well, those are great words to end on. I love that. Better buying, when I think about it, it's like, could this be an heirloom? Am I buying something of quality here that I cherish and that perhaps I could leave, when I leave this earth, and somebody would also cherish it, that's the golden rule, right? If you can meet that requirement, I mean, you're certainly meeting that, and there's everyday things we can do. So thank you for pointing that out. If people want to learn more about Climate Label, is there a place they can go?
Yeah, our website, I particularly like to point people to explore.changeclimate.org, which is where you get right into the directory of companies who are certified. Every company that gets certified has a profile page that details in excruciating detail, but interesting detail, all the things that company has done to measure and address its carbon emissions. And then our website itself has interesting information.
Great. I mean, for those of you who like to nerd out on data, that's a great place. Or, get a short list of companies that you can support and help make the world a better place. So thank you, Austin, for joining, and appreciate your time.
Thanks, Andy, for the conversation.
All right.